is the Mid-America PTTC podcast, where we believe prevention is better together, and together we are stronger. I'm your host, Steve Miller. This is episode 48, and in today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Cindy Miles. She is the president and CEO of the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, but more importantly, she is an advocate for children and families that have been impacted by child abuse and neglect. Cindy serves on the Wichita Coalition for Child Abuse Prevention, the Kansas Alliance for Drug Endangered Children, and is helping to launch the Sedgwick County Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. She and her family have been impacted by child abuse and neglect and addiction, but she is passionate about sharing hope for other families that have been impacted. Before we get into the content, we would like to thank our funder, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. A quick note, although funded by SAMHSA, the content of this recording does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. We got a lot of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome, Cindy Miles. I am so grateful that I had an opportunity to sit down and talk to you on the podcast today.
Steve, I am so thrilled that you asked me to join you today.
Well, I for the background for the audience, I first met Cindy here just recently at the Kansas Alliance for Drug Endangered Children State Conference, where her and her family spoke about the impact of drug use on the family had been. And what impressed me about it so much was that, if you're familiar with DEC and the work they're doing, or you're familiar with addiction and the work that's being done there and the prevention work we're doing here, we know a lot about the stories of how people are impacted or the long-term impact on children as a result of growing up in families where drugs or alcohol are abused. But Cindy and her family painted a wonderful story of hope. And I think that that's really what intrigued me to have this conversation with you. And I think that the audience will find, like you and I have already shared, some insight into the hope that recovery can bring, not only for an individual, but for the entire family. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got from just Cindy Miles to Cindy Miles, the advocate for children that are in abusive or neglective environments, or, for drug endangered children awareness and prevention?
Absolutely, Steve. So I grew up myself with a lot of challenges. I went through a lot of stuff in my childhood, and I worked really hard to get away from that and raise my children in a different way than what I had been raised. And as life would occur, I had 3 daughters that ended up involved with meth. And so we went through a lot of challenging times and trying to help them and all. But what really happened that brought everything to a head, I guess, was the fact that in 2009, my 15-month-old grandson died of a head injury related to child abuse, and his death was considered a homicide. And so that was quite devastating. I had spent many years trying to get away from the life that I had had growing up, not being exposed to drugs and poverty and a lot of other things that I experienced growing up. And so when I lost my grandson, it was devastating. I just can't, I don't have any way to say it other than the fact that it was just absolutely devastating. And again, tied to the use of meth. So I committed myself to advocating for other children. It was something that I was passionate about anyways, but I felt like I couldn't save my grandchild, but I could try to save other children. And so I got involved with the Wichita Coalition for Child Abuse Prevention because that was my way of speaking out. That was my way of speaking on behalf of other children. That was my way of speaking on behalf of other families, trying to look at what's going on in our system, what changes needed to occur, where were the gaps, and what could I just do to help?
So it kind of became just your own personal mission. I mean, as a result of of your own attempts to and successful attempt to have a lifestyle that was free from those substances and the impact of your own upbringing. But we don't get a guarantee on where our children are going to head or what their outcome is going to be in life. But I think that as we won't have time to go into your whole story that you shared with us and the audience at the recent conference. But I think the message in that is that recovery is possible, and not only for you as an individual or for your family, but then later for your daughters and for their family. So can you talk a little bit about that whole notion that recovery is possible?
I will talk about that whole notion that recovery is possible. So that time when I lost my grandson, as I told you, was devastating, but it also put us somewhat on a trajectory, or my girls somewhat on a trajectory to eventually get some help. I, as a parent, had done what I could to try to help them over the years. And I had three, like I said, I had three daughters that got involved in meth. And I've got 17 grandchildren, many which were impacted by addiction in one way or another. But because I was willing to let go and willing to take care of the children that I could take care of in a way that I could take care of, and I was willing to allow them to hit their bottoms per se. I had been willing to feed them if they were hungry, or drive them someplace if they needed to get medical care, but I had to not allow myself to enable them. And by doing so, I allowed them to hit their bottoms, whatever those bottoms tended to be. And as a result, they were able to get clean. All three of my girls are clean from meth today. Their families have been restored. They have connections with their children now. And we as a family really want to share the fact that there is hope for families that have been devastated by addiction, by using drugs, because that's not something that just impacts me or just impacts them personally. It does impact the entire family when you have things that go on similar to what we have experienced. And so that's really just what I want to do, is share hope with other families, and certainly with other grandparents, because my husband and I have raised some of our grandchildren. We've adopted a couple of grandchildren. We've had guardianship of a couple of grandchildren. We had 4 in the house at one point in time, but because we were all able to work together as a family, we are all recovering together, and we're able to come together as a family and support one another and support the kids and help them as they heal as well.
Well, you mentioned in that statement there that you did what you could to help out, but not to really enable them in their addiction. And when I hear you talk about that, and you're kind of sharing a little bit more of that, the story beside that, is that really is that it's at some level that really is that hope. It's like, I'm going to do enough to still be the mother and the grandmother to these grandchildren who are essentially helpless. They'd have to depend on someone.
Yes.
But it really is about this hope that there is something that can happen for my children and then subsequently their children. Is that right? Is that kind of how it feels going through it?
It is. And I can speak on behalf of lots of people. I think that any of us who have ever chosen not to enable, we've had to make that conscious decision. And you've probably heard at some point in time about enabling your children to death. So I was more afraid to enable my children to death than to let them hit a bottom. And it is very, very difficult as a parent to know that your child may be sleeping on the street. Your child may be doing just unfathomable things. I would receive phone calls about whether or not I could just put one of my children up in a hotel for the night so they would have a night in a hotel. And my response would be, yeah, certainly I could afford to do that, but that's just one night. Tomorrow night, you're going to be back exactly where you were or where you're at today. So I didn't feel like putting my child up in a hotel for a night really was helping them make progress. But it is a very hard thing to do as a parent. And I've known lots of parents as well that just couldn't bring themselves to do that and did eventually watch their child die. And certainly when your child or children are using, that's a fear that you have day to day, that the police will show up to your door and let you know they found your child deceased.
Mm. And it's as a parent, I can only imagine that it's terrifying to have to walk through that. But I think that what is all too often overlooked is that detachment process that it sounds like you were able to achieve, where you weren't enabling them, but I don't hear that you ever gave up hope on your daughters getting sobriety and being able to have some family unification. And I think that people think that if you're not enabling or not helping at some extreme level, that you just given up. And I don't know that that's, from what I'm hearing you say, that's not necessarily the case.
That's not necessarily the case. As a matter of fact, I probably continued to have hope for a longer period of time because I wasn't enabling. I think parents maybe become very frustrated because they provide their children a place to stay, or they let them back in the house, or they get them another car, or they give them more cash, or they give them grace and they give them grace, and they try to help and they try to help. And I think that becomes not only frustrating for the parent, so that finally they just throw their hands up and say, there's no use. My child is never going to change. And I think that I was able to maintain that hope because I wasn't doing all those things. I know that sounds really odd, but I had enough faith that I believe, and I had been taught that if you didn't enable your child, they would hit bottom faster. They would find their bottom faster, whatever that bottom is, because it's different for everybody. For some, they would have thought that one of my children losing her child would have been a bottom, and yet for her that wasn't her bottom. She continued to use. And so we have to allow those kids to hit their bottoms. And I don't know if you can ever imagine, there used to be a saying that was kind of popular: if you love something, set it free.
Mm-hmm.
If it, if you love it, if it comes back, it's yours. If not, it never was. So I kind of based my feelings, my beliefs on that. Like, I have to let this go. It's more than what I can fix. I will never be able to fix the addiction issues that my children have. I could pack them up and force them to go someplace to get treatment, but you can't force somebody to get clean if they're not ready to get clean. So I honestly felt the best thing that I could do was turn it over, let God take care of it. And I had the faith to believe that he would, and that they, in time, they'd find their way. We didn't raise our kids that way. We were very involved. And so they were always had a stable home, those types of things. Cause I was very picky about how I raised my children because of my own childhood. So I knew they had that basis. They knew right from wrong. It was just a matter of whether they could break free from that addiction from meth, which is hard.
Yeah. So a lot of questions come out of that. The first one is so how's the family now? You say, you're a family, that's kind of recovering together. Do you play an active role in that on behalf of the grandkids? And are you a part of that on behalf of your own kids, yourself? I mean, How's the family today in this process?
The family is doing wonderful. I have my oldest daughter just celebrated 7 years clean. My youngest daughter is close to 5 years clean. My middle daughter is about the same as what my youngest daughter is. They're all back together in family units, with the exception of the two grandkids that we adopted, but they have ongoing connection with their parents. They choose to stay with us simply because they've been with us for so many years. We've had one of our grandchildren since he was born, and he's 11, and another grandchild we've had her since she was 3 and she's 15. And so they've become accustomed with being with my husband and I. And so they visit and have, constant contact with their parents. They're there on the weekends. They're there sometimes during the week. Their parents are really engaged. And someday they may choose to go live with their parents. But we do things together as a family. We come together as a family on special events. We support each other when we need something. We're just good at doing that, I guess, and identifying. We all help each other out. The kids, my grown kids, have so much appreciation for the fact that my husband and I were able to take care of their kids for a period of time, especially my oldest daughter kids, because I had them for 5 years. And so she's so appreciative of that. But it's, some of us have done therapy together. Some of them have done therapy with their kids. We've all worked through it. We've attend church together. We pray together. It's everything that I could have imagined us being, just like a nice, normal family that does family things together. And we do those these days without, somebody being here drunk or high or upset or starting a fight or not showing up or whatever. So I really want to let families know not to give up, that there really is hope, and that a family can recover together. But it has to, it takes a lot of willingness on everybody's part. I can certainly spend my life, if I chose to, being angry about what's happened, about what the kids have been through, about what I've been through as a parent, about what the families have been through. I can certainly do that, or I can focus on how do we recover? How do we get better? How do we get over what we've experienced? And so that's what we focus on. We can't spend our lives looking at what happened in the past. We can only move forward into the future, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard it said before that hope is an action word, and that's, to me, what it sounds like that you've been a living example of, not only pre-recovery for your family, but also as there's some unification with sharing the family and reintegrating the family, that the hope that you can have the type of family unit that you always strove for in raising your kids. To me, that's hope in action. You're the grandmother, and you had the opportunity to have some or a lot of the grandkids in and out of your life. Do you find this as a kind of common denominator? And are there services or supports for grandparents? Because no, in the perfect world, wherever that exists, but in the perfect world, the kids raise the kids, and those kids raise those kids, and so forth. Most grandparents don't think at some point I'm going to have to raise my grandchildren, and so. Are there supports out there, and do you find that you're able to help other grandparents kind of find, some of the same thing that you've been able to find?
So there are supports. There's not adequate supports for grandparents raising grandchildren. I did start a group a couple of years ago called the Parenting Again Club. We connect mostly grandparents, but other people that are raising relatives, kids, and we connect. And I try to share with them resources. I try to be a sounding board. And sometimes people will call me because they'll hear hear that, I've started this Parenting Again club and they're about to take their grandchildren. They don't know what to expect. So I try to be a support in that way. Kansas Children's Service League certainly does a great job of providing some programs to support grandparents. But it's kind of intriguing that the number of supports really depends on how you came by those grandchildren. So if the grandchildren, they go into DCF care and become involved in a sync case, and then maybe are in a kinship placement where they're placed with grandparents, then there's more supports than if for some reason you're a grandparent and you just see that your kids aren't taking care of their kid, or your child's not taking care of their kids, and you go through a process called guardianship where DCF doesn't get involved. Then it's quite a bit more struggle to find services and support because that child didn't come to you through DCF. And so I try to educate grandparents about what is available, especially those who have taken children through guardianships, as well as educating some of them about what does a guardianship look like, because you don't always have to have a grandchild go into the system, go into DCF's care in order to take custody of that child. So I talk to them about that, but also talk to them about what kind of benefits they can get through DCF, a stipend, a medical card for the child. If you adopt a grandchild, I let them know if they adopt a grandchild and they retire, then they can collect Social Security benefits for that child. And so I try to educate them on all the different resources, as well as where can they get help with therapy for that child, because we as grandparents don't take grandchildren that are just normal grandchildren. They're traumatized in some way, and we're often not prepared to cope with the trauma that child has had. So they're not going to be there's not normal really doesn't, I don't think exists, but they're not going to be a normal child. They're going to have issues, and you as a grandparent certainly going to have to help them work through those issues.
Yeah, that is the part where, people in the general public, from the outside looking in, don't really understand the significant impact that drug use has on a child. But I think that you take a step back from that. I think that all too often people don't really understand this notion of addiction and what that really is all about, because being someone who's gone through that, I'm almost assured that you wouldn't say that your children were choosing this over their own children. The addiction process is what's robbing the very spirit of the family. It's the addiction itself. Is that correct?
That is correct. And you're right. So many people don't understand addiction. Like my children, my daughters would have never been where they would intentionally neglect their children, that this wasn't them. Prior to them using, that just wasn't them. But when they got involved with meth, when they were struggling deep in the depths of their addiction, that changes a person. That it changes how they feel and how they think. They don't think clearly, and so people don't get that. They want to blame the person, and while they make a choice, I guess, to use drugs, once they've gotten involved in drugs, it's not like they can just walk away. It's not that easy. And meth especially is a very addictive drug. It's very hard to walk away from, but it consumes them. And so I also had to explain to the children that it's not that their parent loved them any less. It's not that they're choosing the drug over the child, but to get them to understand the whole part of addiction.
Yeah, understanding that component of the addiction is a significant obstacle just for the general public to get through, because no parent ever thinks, well, yeah, I know my kid's at that age and they may be drinking or, those kinds of things, because that's quote unquote what kids do. No one ever thinks
Yes.
my child's going to be that statistic that becomes that addict that loses
Yep.
all respect for themselves and their children. That's not how it plays out. But it happens all too often. And I don't think we understand that as well, from the outside looking in.
Yes, I agree.
I think your story, not only as we've kind of unpacked this a little bit, I mean, on the outset, we're talking about, hope for recovery for families and that are caught up in addiction, but the hope for recovery itself. I mean, there's so many different facets here. You've got multifamily or multi-generational family recovery going on now, in light of multifamily generational addiction. I mean, there really is a very profound sense of hope that has found a place in your family. I mean, you're blessed and you've been graced. That's certainly evident.
Yeah, I claim every day that what we're experiencing is a true miracle, simply because we're living the lives that we're living. I can't. I just don't know how to say it any other way. And again, I want other families to know that there is hope, to know not to give up, to keep their faith strong. And who knows at what point in time, the lives of their children may turn around, but I just don't want to see them give up hope.
Yeah. So as we kind of part ways, I'm curious, is there like one thing that you could point the audience to as a resource? Is there, a thought that you would want them to hold on to? I mean, what is it? Would you like them to connect with some resources or services out there? What would that look like? What's that one thing that you would like the audience to know about what we've discussed here today?
Yeah. So I think if a parent is got a child, or it doesn't have to necessarily be their child, they know somebody else that's struggling. It might be their niece or their nephew or whatever that's struggling. Certainly checking out the Kansas Alliance for Drug Endangered Children website, the National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children website. I think that both of those are fantastic resources. Steve, don't you have a website there you're in Missouri?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And we'll include the DEC information in the show notes with some links on the podcast. And then we'll also share with them, which I think is kind of exciting. The National Alliance for DEC has just developed what they call the Check DEC app, which is kind of being able to take these resources in the palm of your hand, which is wonderful because they're localized. If I log on to it, it's different in Missouri where I'm at. If you log on to it, because it localizes where you're at. So it'd be good for our audience to know about that. So we'll put that resource in there as well. Thank you so much, Cindy, for being here with us today and sharing a little bit of your story. Like I said, I'm fascinated by it, and I like the message of hope that you're wanting to share.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for having me today and giving me this opportunity to share. I just am very appreciative.
Well, thank you for listening to this Mid-America PTTC podcast. To learn more about any upcoming trainings, visit pttcnetwork.org and look under the Your PTTC Mid-America link. Remember, prevention is better together, and together we are stronger.